Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is the fourth in a series of capacity building webinars hosted by Sea Alliance in collaboration with Global Tuna Alliance, World Benchmarking Alliance, and FishWise. My name is Garrett Okrasinski and I'm a project director on the social responsibility team at FishWise, and I'll be facilitating the presentation today. FishWise is a nonprofit consultancy with a mission to sustain ocean ecosystems and the people that depend on them by transforming global seafood supply chains. Today, in this webinar, we'll be discussing worker engagement. The webinar is being recorded. Participants' audio and video functions are disabled. However, we encourage you to engage via the Q&A feature and chat as well. And if you're having technical issues, please send the host a message and we'll help sort that out. As I mentioned, this is the fourth webinar in this series. The webinar recordings are being hosted on the Sea Alliance website. So if you're unable to attend the last few, please go there and check out some of those recordings. But in the meantime, I hope everyone will be able to see, and we might need to drop in the chat again, the recap from session 3. There's about 4 points that are just to help kind of refresh on what that was. As you'll see here, the next webinar will be on March 9th, and we'll be discussing decent work at sea. And we'll also drop that link in the chat so you can sign up for that as well. So to quickly go over the agenda, first off, we'll start with what companies need to be doing to support worker engagement. Then we'll dive deeper into some of those recommendations. We will then discuss the expectations outlined in the UN guiding principles and how worker engagement should be included through the human rights due diligence process. We have Lucila Granada from Flex, who will be discussing worker engagement through the human rights due diligence process and an interesting pilot they're working on. From there, we'll move to the importance of grievance mechanisms and access to remedy, and how companies can support freedom of association and collective bargaining. And finally, before we go into question and answer, we'll learn from Father Janse at Stella Maris on how he's engaging and supporting workers. So why are we focusing on worker engagement? Worker engagement has been called out as one of the 3 RISE foundations because worker engagement is core to making lasting improvements in seafood supply chains. Worker engagement benefits companies by strengthening operations, enhancing knowledge of supply chain issues, and providing data to verify working conditions and increase confidence that the standards and rights are upheld. Through worker engagement and ultimately trade unions, that has the potential, as ethical trade initiatives have found, to build trust among workers, ensure workplaces are safe, enforce labor standards, improve employee retention, and save money and improve business decisions and increase productivity. Workers should have various means of engaging with their employers to make improvements to working conditions. Freedom of association and collective bargaining are fundamental workers' rights that help workers make these improvements. They also create the conditions for protections of other core labor rights. However, as we know, the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining is illegal or limited or underutilized in some regions and some sectors, like high seas fishing. For these instances, companies can implement a range of activities termed worker engagement that enable workers to interact with employers regarding workplace culture, working conditions, and other issues. To help focus and help companies prioritize efforts, we wanted to highlight 3 key recommendations that we'll unpack more throughout this webinar. The first is engage stakeholders throughout the human rights due diligence process at every stage. This will ensure the steps and responses improve working conditions and uphold workers' rights. The second is provide access and, if necessary, build effective and trusted grievance mechanisms and ensure remedy of the grievances that have been raised. And third is support and proactively remove barriers to freedom of association and collective bargaining. But again, we'll be unpacking these throughout. Before we dive deeper, let's clarify some terms. I'm sure, like you, we've heard a lot of these terms thrown around almost interchangeably. However, before we continue, I think it's important we clarify what we mean. So please, let's not consider these legal definitions, but instead helpful framing for what we're discussing. First, worker feedback tends to be a one-way form of communication from worker to management with little feedback on how workers' concerns are taken into consideration and being addressed. Worker engagement, on the other hand, is a two-way communication, and it includes dialogue regarding suggestions and concerns, and results are communicated back to workers. Stakeholder engagement, as the UN interpretive guidance for business states, is an ongoing process and interaction and dialogue between enterprise and potentially affected stakeholders that enables enterprises to hear and understand and respond to the interests and concerns through collaborative approaches. So it's more about the larger community of people that could be potentially impacted. Grievance mechanisms can be considered a formal process and procedure where workers can raise concerns and seek remedy. And finally, worker voice is about the ability for workers to freely represent their own interests and workplace improvements. Any form of engagement with stakeholders needs to be built on trust with the necessary protections in place so that they can use these engagement channels. We'll discuss this more later on in the presentation. But our discussion today will really focus on effectively engaging workers, building worker grievance mechanisms, and promoting worker voice. So let's move on to our first recommendation with some of those foundations. So our first recommendation is companies should prioritize and engage stakeholders throughout the human rights due diligence process. While this recommendation states stakeholders, which includes all communities and individuals impacted or potentially impacted by your company's operations, we're really zeroing in on workers throughout this presentation. As we'll hear more later on, when engaging stakeholders, it's key to connect with existing local grassroots organizations and partner with them to better understand operations and potential impacts. So to safely and effectively engage workers, there are essential elements to keep in mind. And note, these are just a few to keep in mind. It's not an all-encompassing list. But before companies reach out and try to engage with workers to better understand working conditions or some of their concerns, proper protections need to be in place to engage workers. This includes ensuring that policies and processes are in place to protect workers' confidentiality and protect them from reprisal. Second, invest time and resources to establish processes to meaningfully engage workers and to build trust. And tap into existing trusted networks. This includes building relationships and financially supporting existing trusted networks like grassroots organizations I just mentioned earlier. Third, communication should be two-way and done in good faith with genuine intention for improvements. And this also includes with participation from both parties. And finally, it's important to do not undermine worker organizations, but to work with them. It's essential to work with unions and worker organizations and not circumnavigate or create parallel pathways or to undermine their role. But like I mentioned, these are just a few to keep in mind. So please, from your experiences, I'd love for you guys to drop in the chat. Or there's something that's missing from this list, or something from your experience that I might not have highlighted that would be helpful for the community as they look to implement some worker engagement mechanisms. So please feel free to drop that in the chat. So using a familiar framework that we've been discussing throughout this series, let's take a moment to look at it through the lens of worker engagement. But if you're just joining us for the first time today, that's great. This is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, is often referred to as the UNGPs, have become the authoritative global standard for preventing and addressing the risk of adverse human rights impacts linked to business. It sets out three key pillars. It's the duty to protect. This is the duty governments have. The responsibility to respect human rights, and this is a responsibility businesses have. And the third pillar is access to remedy. And this is the recognition that even when governments and companies are doing their best to implement the UN guiding principles, negative human rights impacts may still occur. And when they do, affected people need to be able to seek remedy. But in this series, we've really been focusing on companies' responsibility to respect human rights. A company under the UN guiding principles at a baseline must prevent and address negative impacts, know and show that it respects human rights, and demonstrate that they understand the context in which their business operates. To do that, they should have 3 key elements in place: a public commitment, an ongoing process of human rights due diligence informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement, and then they need to develop a process for remedy to anyone who's harmed as a result of the organization's actions or decisions. So to break it down a little further, I've called out specific ways in which companies can support worker engagement at each component. With a public commitment, it's important that companies support freedom of association, commit to engaging with workers and other stakeholders throughout the human rights due diligence process, and ultimately commit to creating binding commitments with trade unions and worker organizations. In the human rights due diligence process should be informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement. According to the UNGPs, this should seek to understand the concerns of potentially affected stakeholders by consulting them directly in a manner that takes into account language and other potential barriers to effective engagement. In situations where consultation is not possible, businesses should consider reasonable alternatives, such as consulting credible, independent expert resources, including human rights defenders and others from civil society. So as a reminder, human rights due diligence process is about risk to workers and communities. Companies should prioritize risk to workers and rights holders through their business operations that they may have caused, contributed, or linked to, and not only just prioritize business risks. In developing and implementing a human rights due diligence process, workers should be consulted at every stage. And then also, workers and rights holders should be consulted at every stage in the design and implementation of these interventions. And we'll hear more from Lucila at Flex about this. Workers should also be included in the design of the grievance mechanisms. This will help ensure that they are tailored to the needs and are trusted and hopefully leveraged more. Again, engagement with stakeholders should not undermine existing unions or organizations, and avoid using just management-led engagement that can undermine worker organizations. Instead, identify existing organizations and seek to partner with them. And finally, in improving access to remedy, workers and other stakeholders should be, as UN Guiding Principle states, stakeholders should be engaged in the design and performance to ensure that it meets their needs and that they will use it in practice, and that they share the interest in ensuring its success. Worker engagement and the existence of grievance mechanisms can work to evaluate if proper remedy has been received. So just think of this as also an important feedback loop. So with kind of that foundation, I want to introduce Lucila Granada, the Chief Executive from Focus on Labor Exploitation, or Flex. She will speak to Flex's worker engagement pilot and how workers should be engaged throughout the human rights due diligence process. She will share an interesting project in the UK service sector where they're utilizing meaningful worker engagement methods to ensure that workers are at the front and center of identifying risk and developing solutions to issues that affect them. So thank you for being here with us today. You want to take it away?
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting us to speak and present our work. Yes, my name is Lucila Granada. I'm the Chief Executive of Flex. It's the full name of the organization is Focus on Labor Exploitation. And I'm here to speak about our pilot project, which is very much at the very early stages. We are working with 2 companies and a specialist women-only organization to engage workers in piloting worker engagement in human rights due diligence. So next slide, please. I'll say a couple of words about Flex, and mainly to sort of give some context also to the logic of our project. So we are a research and policy organization dedicated to preventing labor exploitation by identifying and helping address the systems and structures that create vulnerabilities for workers. So including poorly designed immigration laws and systems, and working towards things like better recognition of the impact of structural inequalities at work, better business practices, stronger labor market enforcement systems, and so on. Next slide, please. Our understanding is that labor exploitation doesn't happen in isolation from the rest of the labor market, but can be driven by a range of factors that are related to several policy areas than the ones I listed before. These factors shape working conditions and workers' experiences across what we call a spectrum of experiences in the labor market. This can go from what you might call decent work or compliance situations to situations where there are labor abuses, all the way to more severe forms of abuse at the workplace, amounting to criminal types of exploitation, like the ones included in the category of modern slavery in the UK. Now, why we take this approach is because we, through our research and previous research, also shows that minor violations can create the conditions for more severe exploitation to develop. And this is important because in our focus on prevention of forced labor or modern slavery in the UK, we don't only focus on the more severe forms of abuse, but instead we look at reducing the risk of labor exploitation across the spectrum. So also addressing labor abuses. Next slide, please. So here's an overview, quick overview of the project, and then I'll take you away to talk about other elements that we need to consider that we had to consider in the development of the project. But just to give you a quick overview, what we're doing is developing a corporate human rights due diligence framework for domestic service supply chains. We are working on cleaning in particular, and I'll explain in a bit why we're doing that. This is a 2-year project in partnership with a specialist frontline organization. It's a women-only community-led organization. It's what you'd call a led by and for. So the organization itself also represents the beneficiaries. And we are doing worker engagement throughout the project, involving outsourced women that are working in the cleaning sector. At the moment, we're working with 2 companies. And the main activities of the project are to develop the framework, which includes an assessment tool that is informed by the workers, so with indicators that are worker informed. We will also produce a roadmap with clear referral pathways, complaints mechanisms, and we're working also with supporting the businesses throughout. But I'll focus on the worker engagement element here. Next slide, please. So why cleaning? Cleaning is a high-risk sector. Just a quick overview so that you know the reasons why we chose this. It's a sector that is mainly a feminized sector. 81% are women, 53% are migrants and ethnic minority workers. And in terms of Latin Americans, well, cleaning is an entry point into the UK labor market, where they report endemic levels of abuse. So you have a few stats there. 61% have experienced issues with their pay, 60% dangerous working conditions, and 86% health and safety issues. Health issues that are related to their work. Partly has to do with the nature of the work, repetitive movements, the use of chemicals, and so on. But there's also an element of not having breaks and having to work multiple contracts. Next slide, please. So in terms of the sector as a whole, these are the main issues that we've identified through research. Issues with pay, as I mentioned, this included unpaid work hours, illegal deductions that are linked to sometimes equipment, sometimes are just very so unexplained deductions from their pay. There's also payments below the national minimum wage, underpayment of holiday time, and so on. Issues, taking time off when ill is another big issue in the sector. A lot of the people we spoke to are unable to take time off when they're ill. This has to do with partly because a lot of times the amount of hours that they work for each individual contract will not amount to for them to qualify for statutory sick pay, but there is also a level of pressure for not taking annual leave. The fact that a lot of these contracts are casual, and so they risk not being called back, and so on. Safe working conditions or unsafe working conditions is another issue. The lack of protective equipment, like I said, no breaks. Abusive workloads that have to do with sometimes changes in companies, leading cleaning companies at the top of the contract, or sometimes when during COVID, for instance, where there was a reduction on staff, the expectation was that the remaining staff would cover for the rest. So changes in the workloads and I guess unregulated workloads along with pressure. And then finally, equal treatment. As I mentioned, it's a feminized sector, and there's a lot of concerns around discrimination, sexual harassment, and maternity rights. The quote that I've included there is from one of our research projects. I've included the reference there is from a cleaner who reported a situation of sexual harassment to her line manager. Instead of an investigation, the response she received was, "Don't worry," he said, "you're not his type." So that's just to illustrate the conditions there. Next slide, please. So general barriers experienced by workers in reporting abuse. What we found, obviously, language barriers when we're talking about quite a high proportion of migrant and ethnic minority workers in the sector. Language barrier was a huge issue in being able to access information, having access to understanding their rights in the UK, but also where to seek support. So limited knowledge and access to support services. High levels of financial dependency that have to do with the fact that this is a low-income sector, but also crossed by immigration-related issues, and the fact that many people on visa, well, most visa conditions will include a no recourse to public funds clause, so no access to social security in cases of risk of destitution. And then, as I mentioned, insecure contracts. There was also there are also issues of multiple dependencies in cases where the employer also provides accommodation and the risk of homelessness as a result of losing work. And then there are a number of other barriers that are related to the context of in the UK or the context in that specific sector. So lack of access to justice is one key one, lack of enforcement action, and the fact that in cases of outsourcing where you may have different groups of workers working in the same location, but that are contracted directly by different outsourced contracted companies, it's quite difficult sometimes to understand who is responsible for certain abuses. And there is also the quite striking fear of being blacklisted. So these are large companies that hold multiple contracts. If I am blacklisted by this large cleaning company, I might end up becoming banned from a lot of the job opportunities in the area. And so with this pilot, we wanted to push ourselves to trial what meaningful worker engagement would look like within a mandatory human rights due diligence effort, but also how could we ensure that workers would inform that process from day one. Now, before I speak about our project, which is again in the very initial phases, I've included in this presentation 3 slides that will hopefully help inform your own reflections around worker engagement. So next slide, please. This one is a framework of participation that was developed by Arnstein. We were just hearing about the difference between feedback and participation, and feedback and engagement. This framework helped us assess our own achievements or how far we've gotten in relation to power sharing and our ability to engage or ensure participation of workers in different areas of our project. So the framework distinguishes between different levels of participation that go from the most tokenistic approaches, such as manipulation, decoration, or limiting the efforts to informing workers, to more participatory approaches that can go from consulting with workers to involving workers in decision-making, but without guaranteeing them that their views will be acted on, to partnership with workers and delegated power, which in these cases, their views have more weight on decision-making, and even sometimes workers take on responsibilities, to full worker control. So it's just to really be able to assess, well, first of all, establish very concrete objectives, and also assess, again, how much we're achieving in that sense. Next slide. And this one is just to ensure that there is a mention of WSR, the worker-driven social responsibility model, which is a really interesting model, particularly where unions' presence is weak. It's a worker-led model that allows to address the downward pressure on wages and conditions that is, I guess, made by perhaps the lead company or the market pressures from that lead companies are under. And it's based on two key elements, that is a supplier code and a legally binding contract. I'm not going to explain this model. I'm just leaving this slide here for your reference in case you're interested. As you can see, the model at the bottom includes an independent monitoring authority, and this independent authority will conduct monitoring, auditing, and regular inspections, and also respond to workers' complaints. But I'm just leaving it here along with the next slide, which is also a sort of a summary of the existing WSR programs, which is there just to show that even though the structure of the model and all the elements are present across all of these programs, they're quite different. There's differences in scale, in scope, in length of the projects, and so on. So I'll leave these slides here for your reference, and I invite you to have a look at the work of the WSR network, where you can find more information about them. But going back to our project, after looking at the WSR programs and seeing the value of worker-led initiatives, we developed our pilot project, which is unfortunately not a WSR program, but it is sort of inspired by the principles of WSR. So our aim was to assess the risk on working conditions, including the gender dynamics at play in this sector, and tailor recommendations for actions that are informed by workers. The outputs are already mentioned, and what we've done essentially in terms of worker engagement is to run we're running over a period of 2 years, a number of workshops and group discussions that are covering a range of topics that go from excessive working hours, time off, sick leave, discrimination, language barrier, health and safety, immigration conditions affecting ability to report, freedom of association, access to remedies, sexual harassment, forced labor, all the issues that were identified through research, but also allowing the space for the workers to add more or raise more concerns, particularly as we went through a pandemic, and a lot of the issues that were identified in previous research might have changed or exacerbated. So to do this, next slide. To do this, what we've, I guess I tried to summarize how we, or sort of summarize our approach to doing this, I suppose. What we've done is select or sort of focus on the groups that are represented in the sector that are perhaps marginalized groups, or that will experience a higher level of vulnerability, that will be representative of the communities in the sector, but focusing primarily on those more vulnerable to labor exploitation. And so, like as I mentioned before, we're working with outsourced Latin American women in cleaning. And this is an ongoing group. This is another, I guess, sort of takeaway so far, that about the importance of longer term engagement of a group of workers in the development of these tools. So as I mentioned, this is ongoing longer term work with the same group of women. In this partnership, the reason why we partner, as was mentioned before, with a grassroots organization is also to address a number of barriers. This, engaging with a community-led group allows you to address the language barrier for sure, but then also provide for a space that is safe and familiar, and where there is already existing trust. In the case of our project, this is a women-only space also, which also addresses the sort of power dynamics and inequalities that could be replicated in other spaces in terms of gender dynamics. The organization also provides creche support, so allows women with childcare responsibility to also participate, because otherwise, and we saw that maternity rights was quite a key issue also experienced by workers in the sector. This also allows for a more holistic approach. And again, the experiences of workers will not happen in isolation from the rest of their their living situations. And a lot of times they have sort of, they influence each other. And so working with an organization that provides wraparound support was really important for us, not only to address the most urgent needs, but also to contribute to the community's capacity to self-organize and to continue building knowledge within the community. So I'll leave it here. I believe that's all my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And we look forward to hearing how that pilot project turns out, or how that continues, but definitely some similarities in some of the issues that are faced in the fishing industry as well. And I really like, the partnering with those grassroots organizations to help try to remove some of those barriers, and that the engagement isn't happening in isolation from their work. So this is, a lot to learn, a lot to share across sectors. So thank you for sharing that. And Lucila will be staying on for question and answer. So please jot down any questions you may have for her, or please place them in the Q&A feature, and we can respond to those towards the end. So the second recommendation we have is for companies to provide access to effective and trusted grievance mechanisms and ensure remedy for workers. So despite best efforts, companies may have caused or contributed to something that had an adverse impact. When this happens, it's the responsibility of companies and those involved to engage or cooperate in remedying the situation. So grievance mechanisms are essential because they can act as a backstop to identify risks and harms within a supply chain operation. So with actual engagement, it's also important to have outlets like a grievance mechanism. So with audits and stakeholder engagement and other forms of proactive identification, grievance mechanisms, when effective, reliable, and trusted, can be an early warning system. Additionally, they can help companies identify if proper remedy has been received and provide another outlet to hear from workers. However, if grievance mechanisms are poorly designed or implemented, as the UNGP states, it can risk the compounding sense of grievance among affected stakeholders by heightening the sense of disempowerment and disrespect in the process. So in order to be effective, grievance mechanisms should be legitimate, accessible, predictable, equitable, transparent, rights compatible, so aligned with international human rights, and a source of continued learning. Engaging workers in the design process and evaluating performance will help build a shared interest in ensuring that the grievance mechanisms are used. We'll drop a link in the chat for a good resource from Verite on establishing effective grievance mechanisms that you can refer to later on as well. Our third piece of advice is to support and proactively remove barriers to promote freedom of association and collective bargaining. In supporting workers to organize, you will give workers more power to improve working conditions and reduce potential abuses. As mentioned earlier, the Ethical Trade Initiative found it will also improve workers' protection, productivity and reduced turnover as well. So there are three initial ways companies can support freedom of association. The first is develop a policy, as the Ethical Trade Initiative has found, and has provided some example language that could be included in this policy, like workers are free to join associations in their own choosing. Managers should not interfere with workers who wish to lawfully and peacefully associate, organize, or collectively bargain. The decision should be made whether or not to do so, made solely by workers. So again, there's some great resources there that we can share following this on what specifically could be included in this policy. But in thinking about developing this policy, it's also important to look at your company's internal operations and policies towards that. So how has your company supported freedom of association? What lessons can be learned from how your company operates that can be shared with your suppliers? And how can your company demonstrate their leadership in this area? Secondly, identify risk within your supply chain where freedom of association is illegal or underutilized. As the Ethical Trade Initiative also states, the lack of freedom of association is considered a salient risk to workers in their supply chain and can affect the workplace in multiple ways. And finally, develop an action plan and strategy to support workers' associations. Speak with your suppliers in areas where there's low unionization, verbalize your support, work collectively with them to identify opportunities to support worker organizations. And identify your current operation as an engagement. Are there areas where you could possibly be undermining worker organizations and where you could change your approach? So we'll share this link from the Ethical Trade Initiative in the chat as well, where you can build out these strategies more. So if we move on, how do we know we're on the right track and what metrics should we be looking at to measure progress? So as we've shared before, the World Benchmarking Alliance, the Seafood Stewardship Index is a benchmark of the 30 most influential seafood companies, including aquafeed producers, fishing and aquaculture companies, as well as processors. On the next slide, you will see how the Seafood Stewardship Index relates to World Benchmarking's overall benchmarking process. On the following side, as a part of World Benchmarking Alliance's has a focus on social assessments. They're divided into two sets of indicators. First are 18 core indicators, which are applied to all companies across World Benchmarking Alliance's benchmarks. And there you will find the human rights due diligence indicators. And there's a food and seafood specific indicators, which are applied to food and seafood companies. You'll find the forced labor, child labor indicators, as these are considered particularly relevant in food and agriculture sector. In the light box, you will see the first steps of the human rights due diligence indicators. And then the darker boxes, I've tried to call out how you can evaluate and measure stakeholder engagement. On the next slide, I'm not going to go into these in detail. Again, you can refer back to them later, and we'll make sure that you have the Helen Packard, who's leading this contact. But I did want to provide this as a resource here. So D6 is about stakeholder engagement in identifying and assessing impacts. D7 is about grievance mechanisms for workers and evaluates the presence of these channels. But while presence of a grievance mechanism is not enough, it's also important to dig a little deeper into this to also evaluate how is it being used. Here it might be helpful to evaluate, is this the right mechanism? Is it being used, and is it trusted by workers? The next slide, D8, discusses mechanisms for external individuals to share if they have been adversely impacted by a company's operations. And D12 identifies if a company is disclosing information on collective bargaining agreements and how companies support freedom of association and collective bargaining. So there's a lot more to unpack there, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Helen Packard at the World Benchmarking Alliance. She leads the Seafood Stewardship Index, and she'd be happy to speak with you more. So with that, enough hearing from me. I want to transition over to Father Janse from Stella Maris. Father Janse is currently the Regional Director of the Scalabrini International Migration Network for Australia Asia. He's also the Director of Stella Maris International Migrant Service Center in Taiwan and the Port Chaplain in the Archdiocese of Kaohsiung. Father Janse will discuss his work supporting and engaging fishers in Taiwan, and he'll also provide you with some recommendations from his experience on how companies can support workers. So I know it's late your time. Thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Thank you, Garrett. Hi, everyone. I am Father Janse, currently working in Stella Maris Kaohsiung, Southern Taiwan. We can just go directly to the next slide. Certainly, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share our work with you. Most probably, many of you asked, what do we do in Kaohsiung? We conduct regular visits in the ports and also in the fishing vessels. And last year, we have reached out to 5,308 fishers. And the purpose of our visit in the port is to spend time with them, try to listen to the fishers and verify their working conditions. Most of the fishers that we meet in the ports are coming from Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. So how do we build the trust with workers? First of all, we have to let them understand that we truly care. And it can be done by spending quality time with them, try to listen to their stories, not only the stories in far distances, but also their personal stories, the stories of their families. And also we try as much as possible to connect with them as they sail in far distances. Many fishers, when they arrive in Singapore or in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Mauritius and some other countries, they will connect with us through social media. And we try to increase their trust with us. We try to organize activities for their mental health, such as recreational nights, outings. We visit some of the beautiful places in southern Taiwan, and we try to organize sports. These activities have helped us to be closer with the fishers. Certainly, one of the important things that we have to do is try to assist them in their grievances, because a lot of fishers, we have good number of fishers who complain about what they experience in the ship, and we try to help them. Next slide, please. As you know, in the ports, there are several organizations, self-organized communities of fishers, and we try to be closer with them. We spend time with them in their activities and try to help them in organizing activities. By joining them in their activities, they come to know us more, and they begin to build trust also with Stella Maris. Just last November 2022, we organized for first time the Leaders Summit, the leaders of all these 23 organizations of fishers and migrant communities. Next, please. Because since they trust us so much, we receive a lot of complaints from them. In last 2 years, we have assisted 160 cases of fishers. and most of them are from Indonesia and Philippines. Next slide, please. And they call us, they ask for help, not only from Taiwan, but also from abroad. Some of them are calling, asking for help from Mauritius, from Indonesia, from Seychelles, and some other places, even from Solomon Island. Next slide, please. We have indicated 26 fishing vessels who are involved in these cases. Next slide, please. What are the complaints that we receive? Most of them are related to salary, unpaid salary, or unexplained deductions. And also on the repatriation, they finish the contract, but they are forced to continue to work in the fishing vessel, even if they don't want to continue to work in the fishing vessels. So we try to help them to be repatriated back home. And also there are some complaints about bad treatment and forced labor at sea. And also there are several cases of complaints on lack of food and drinks. There are also some threat and physical abuse. Some fishers also complain about the validity of contract, because some are paid not according to the contract, but maybe they delayed it like 2 or 3 months, something like that. And we have three cases of life insurance. Supposed to be, they have to be paid 1 million NT dollar, but the family only received not even half. That's why they complain to us. Next slide, please. So I will spend more time in this because it is very important to know how we work in the port. Most probably, you ask me, how do we work to resolve the issues we have identified? Here are some of the issues that we encounter in the port. I indicated some of them. There are still other issues, but these ones are more important. We discovered that there is most of the fishers are elementary and high school graduates. That's why they don't really understand the labor laws or the regulations related to their employment. Due to lack of education, they are vulnerable to be abused. That's why because of this issue, we try to educate them on labor laws and regulations related to their employment, so that they can really know their rights and their obligations. And we also discovered that there is a kind of lack of means of communication. The fishers are isolated at sea, and that's why sometimes the problems arise. For example, just an example, there are some fishers who are not paid for 14 months. 14 months. Certainly they do not know if their salaries are transferred, because they don't have means to connect with their families to ask if their salaries have been transferred or not. And also we discover bad working condition. That's why Stella Maris try to insist on Wi-Fi access for fishers on board. We are doing this campaign now with some other organizations, even some international organizations, to push this campaign for 5E on board. And another problem we discover is about bad working conditions. Some fishers complain about long working hours or bad treatment at sea. But we cannot really know about this because we cannot monitor it. That's why we supported the government's effort to install CCTV on board, so that they can monitor the movements and also the living conditions in the ship. There is also lack of facilities for fishers' wellness. For example, bathrooms, hot water in the ports, or some other facilities. That's why we try to push the competent authorities to build facilities for fishers in the port. Just last Wednesday, I'm very happy because in Yampu Fishing Port, the government has built the facilities for fishers, resting area, place for worship, and also bathrooms with hot water. It is really a good news for us because we have started that one. We have started to push the government since last year. There is also rampant salary deduction or unpaid salary. This problem is very common, as we have seen in the data earlier. In order to, how do you call this, to lessen this issue or to take away this issue, to solve this issue, we try to push the government to have this kind of direct transfer to the bank account of the fishers. And I'm very happy that this, how do you call this, this suggestion from us has been accommodated in the new revision of the regulations in Taiwan. So they are obliged to transfer directly the salaries to the bank accounts of the fishers. Another problem that we have encountered is that lack of monitoring system. We try to push the government to have more ship inspections and also to create credible network with sending countries. I'm very happy also to inform you that Taiwan government has hired more inspectors for ship inspection in the fishing for ship inspection. I guess with that effort, it can also lessen the possibility of abuses in the fishing vessel. Next slide, please. I know that the government is very important because they are making the policies for the fishers. That's why we try to conduct a regular communication with the government institutions, because we believe that we have the common responsibility to protect the rights of the fishers. We really hope that they can consider fishers as key workers, because without fishers, we cannot eat fish and seafood. Last year, we have 24 meetings with government, with Taiwan government, Indonesian Economic and Trade Office, Manila and Economic Cultural Office, Thailand Trade and Economic Office, American Institute in Taiwan, British Office, and also we did the visit to Department of Migrant Workers in Manila and the National Board for Placement and Protection of Indonesian Overseas Workers in Jakarta. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. We believe that we cannot be always, we cannot be an ambulance always, you know. There is a need for better policies, because with better policies, you can reach out to a lot of fishers, you can protect more fishers. That's why, in order to have better policies, we try to understand the real needs of the fishers. We try to spend time with them, quality time with them. We listen to them. We indicate some problems, some important issues that need to be regulated well. And then after that, we bring them to the table when we have the meetings with government and other stakeholders like the fishing companies, tuna associations, squid associations, all the stakeholders during the meeting. And I am very happy to communicate to you that some improvements have been done in Taiwan with the new regulations that has been approved in May 2022. And the improvements are the salary increase. Previously, the salary is only $450, but now the salary is increased by $100, becomes $550. And then they also put in the regulation the direct transfer of salary. The direct transfer is very important because you can also control whether they have given the salary to the fishers or not, and also to avoid that kind of difference in the exchange rate, you know. And also we need to monitor also the working condition in the ship. That's why I'm very happy that the installation of CCTV has been actualized in all the fishing vessels in Taiwan. Now there are also more ship inspections because they have hired more inspectors in fisheries department. We are also grateful because the life insurance has been increased from 1 million Taiwan dollar to 500,000 Taiwan dollar, and some other improvements. You can maybe ask more questions later. Next. Now, what are our recommendations for the companies? First of all, we have to understand that it is between fishers and companies, there is a kind of mutual need. Fishers need companies to get jobs so that they can support their families back home, and the companies need fishers in order to gain more profits in their business. No, but we hope that this relationship will not put down the other party, especially the fishers. There must be a balance between the profit and the welfare of the fishers. When we discussed about the increase of salary last year, I told the Taiwan government, you know, your salary is only 450. There are around 30,000 fishers in Taiwan fishing vessel. If you try to compare between the profit, between the total income of a year with the salary of the fisher, is very, very small. The total income is like 1.9 billion US dollar, while the salary of the fishers, if you try to count it, 450 times 30,000 fishers times 12 months, it will go to like 162 million, less than 10% from the total income. So you can see that they focus more on the profit, not on the person. Now, if you want to work with the fishing companies, for example, in Taiwan or in any other countries, it is always better to choose the right business partners that ensure the protection of the rights of the fishers. That's why it is always important to have that kind of pilot project with good companies. Try to choose the better companies, recommended companies, and then try to work with them first so that you can create a good condition, good business condition when you ensure the protection of the rights of the fishers. I really recommend, and I hope that you can also support us in the access of Wi-Fi on board for fishers. Because if you are doing something good, you will not hide anything. You will be transparent in doing your business. So the Wi-Fi will be very important because CCTV cannot monitor everything, but it is very important to how to call this, to have Wi-Fi so that they can communicate with their families for their mental wellness, and also to communicate with other organizations that support them in case they have problem at sea. And then hopefully we can increase the spirit of collaboration from all stakeholders, not only within the companies, but also with the government, with the NGOs, with the human rights activists, all the stakeholders, so that where we can have the common goal, that is to respect the human rights of the fishers. Okay, next slide, please. Now, before I end my presentation, let me share to you how we work also, because you know we have limited financial support. Like last year, we have only 15,000 US dollar from Scalabrini International Migration Network to do our work. But what makes us strong is that the support of the young people. We try to involve young students, university students, those baccalaureate art students, master art students, even PhD students to join us in our activities. And their help will be very significant in doing all the activities that we have. Certainly, we do some trainings with them so that they know how to deal with fishers. We have around 65 volunteers and staffs participated in 7 of our formation activities through the year. These volunteers are coming from Indonesia, Filipinos, Taiwanese, and Vietnamese. So when we meet, like example, Filipino officer, the Filipino student will talk with them. And if we meet the Indonesian officer will talk with them, try to listen to them. And to conclude my presentation, I really like to quote what Spider-Man 1 was saying, great power comes with great responsibility. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear more about what you do. And I love what you said too about we can't continue to be the ambulance. So thank you. I do realize we are at time. So we're going to just move into question and answer. So and we're going to have a hard stop at 10 past. But I did see in the chat there was a question around, or a direct message to me, I'm sorry, around suppliers and code of conducts and social audits. And if you look at the use of social audits as a way to evaluate like worker engagement and the issues related that to worker representation. So how can, if companies are using social audits, how can you make sure that it's an effective check on worker engagement and not just a tick box exercise? We also will have Andy joining us from Sea Alliance too. So Andy, please, if you have any comments or responses to that. But thank you, Lucila, Father Yance, and Andy for answering questions today.
Thanks, Garrett. And first of all, thanks so much to Lucila and Father Yance. I thought those were excellent presentations. Just a quick thought from me on this. I think we're regularly quite critical about social audits, and I think it is the case in my experience that they aren't particularly effective at robustly assessing worker engagement and issues relating to worker representation. That's my experience. Having said that, I think there are clearly improvements that can be made through the right kind of training for auditors so that they fully understand issues surrounding worker representation. And then I think the other thought would be that the better quality the worker interviewing that takes place in social audits, the more likely you are to really understand workers' experience of how their employers are engaging them. But I think more and more we're understanding that approaches other than social audits are needed if we're going to truly embed effective worker engagement.
Yeah, thank you, Lucila. Father Yance, do you have anything to add on social audits and how we could better leverage them?
Yeah, it is very important to have these social audits, but I guess it can be done through listening to non-government organizations or human rights activists, because most of them are spending time with grassroots, with visas or with migrants, and they have more access with visas, the complaints. And for that reason, it is very important to gather all these stakeholders to come together and to be transparent, to listen. Even sometimes it hurts, but it is very important that we listen to them, because by listening to them, we can really empower ourselves for that common goal for protection of the rights of the fishers. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That Lucila, I see I have another question for you around how do you implement and create worker engagement mechanisms or grievance mechanisms that capture the voices of the most vulnerable workers, like migrant workers and women? We find, some people can find that this often is still missing in the development of that.
Well, one of the key points that that we try to keep in mind as much as possible when doing this type of work is that there will need to be tailored approaches to the different workplaces. So we were discussing before the use of CCTV, and I saw comments around whether this is desirable or not, and possibly not across the board, but we could, for instance, I mean, I can give you an example from hospitality, for instance, where the CCTV cameras are pretty much installed to protect clients, the customers of the hotels. But then a lot of the labor abuses happen, and particularly sexual harassment of women in hotels will happen in the spaces that are not monitored by CCTV. So you will find that in those spaces is a very desired action to be taken by the workers will always prefer that. That's our finding. But likewise, you might not find that in other sectors. So I think it's important to try and not kind of come up with or expect the grievance mechanisms and the monitoring elements and the actions that are preferred by workers to be, one action for, to apply across the board. That's the first instance. And just on the point on social audits, I was going to say, of course, these approaches will take resources and time. And so, social audits can be helpful as, in combination with this kind of approaches that might not cost as much. However, the point on training is crucial, but also kind of keeping in mind that trust is a key element when it comes to ensuring that the efforts being made are actually achieving results that will have an impact on the realities of these workers. So again, considering collaborations with organizations and groups that are already trusted by those groups.
Thank you for that. So I see a question in the Q&A around CCTV. So Father Janse, could you speak a little bit more to that and how this has been effective in improving working conditions and around issues of who has access to the video, and if there's anything else you'd like to add about that?
Actually, the new revision of the regulations on distant water fishes is taken into actions since July last year. So we cannot evaluate yet how effective it is. But it is very important when you have the grievances from the fishers to have a kind of evidences of what is really happening in the ship. And I believe that it is the competent authorities who will have the access for the CCTVs on board. But personally, I believe that it is not enough just to install CCTV, because there are some things that cannot be observed by CCTV, like the case that I told you. They are not paid for 14 months. Of course, CCTV cannot detect that one. But if they have the Wi-Fi access on board, they can send message to their families or to the organizations that can help them, telling them to check whether their salaries are transferred or not. So both things are very important. CCTV for the evidence when there is grievances in the on fishing vessel from the fishers, and Wi-Fi to make sure that they can be assisted or help in their grievances.
Thank you for that.
Garrett, I would just add that I've learned a lot from Father Janse in this presentation, also in previous conversations, just about how critical Wi-Fi or internet access is on board fishing vessels. And I think it's definitely something for us as a group to take away, to think about how we can understand how prevalent it is that workers don't have access to internet on board, and what we can do as a group to try and promote access to the internet, and also understand what the regulations are that we might be able to hang any asks of suppliers on when we engage with them on that.
Great, yeah, thank you, and definitely something for us to focus on it and take away. So thank you very much. I do realize we're over time. So if you go to the following slide, you will see our next webinar is on March 9th. So please look for an invite to that and sign up now, but we will follow up with this recording. If you have any other additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Andy or myself, and we'll make sure you have that contact, and we'll get those questions answered for you. So thank you for being here with us today. I know your time is valuable and we appreciate you spending it with us, and we will see you on March 9th. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.